Now at the Home Depot, save up to 35% off appliance special buys, like the Samsung stainless steel side-by-side refrigerator, just $9.98. You save $300. It's big enough to hold 25 bags of groceries. Unload those, and if that makes you thirsty, you'll really love the external ice maker and water dispenser. Today is the day for doing. Spring Black Friday savings now at the Home Depot. More saving, more doing. U.S. only while supplies last. See store for details. Valid through April 17th.
Welcome to Creating a Family, talk about infertility and adoption. Today we're going to be talking about interpreting the results of genetic testing on embryos, a hot topic for sure for our audience. Fascinating discussion. I think you're going to enjoy it. Here's a sample of what you're going to hear.
So the way I usually explain this to my patients before they even decide whether they want to do PGS or not, I explain to them that what the data shows us now is that about a third of embryos that actually come back with a normal result after PGS still do not result in successful pregnancies. So I tell them that PGS is a fantastic technology and can really help us to figure out which is their best embryo and is most likely to lead to pregnancy, but PGS, unfortunately, is not perfect.
I'm Dawn Davenport. I'm the director of Creating a Family. We are the National Infertility and Adoption Education and Support nonprofit. You can find us online at creatingafamily.org. One of the things we do here at Creating a Family is create resources. In fact, that's a big part of what we do. We add 4 to 5 pieces of new resources, not pieces of, but new resources to our website every single week. One resource that I think you will find to be very useful is a multimedia guide we published titled How to Choose an Infertility Clinic. It is about 50-some-odd pages. It is chock full of detailed information to help you make what is probably the most important decision you're going to make on your infertility journey. We've got questionnaires. We've got expert Q&As. We've got a really, really good section on how to interpret the statistics, the IVF success statistics. We tell you to look at them. Generally, we're telling you that, but in this guide, we're giving you concrete information about which ones are most important, how to find them, how to assess what you're looking for. I really think you're going to find this entire multimedia guide really helpful. To find it, you can go to our website, creatingafamily.org, hover over the word resources, and click on eGuides, and it will take you right there. The Creating a Family radio show is underwritten by our corporate sponsor, Ferring Pharmaceutical. For women who have been undergoing fertility treatment and are still struggling to conceive, there are so many daily scenarios and interactions and conversations that really will take a toll on your emotional health. There is a fairly new app release called Ferticom. It was developed by Dr. Ali Domar, who's been on our show many times, and Dr. Elizabeth Grill, both a reproductive psychologist, and certainly Ali is a long-term researcher in the impact of mind-body and how it influences treatment. They developed the app, Ferticom, to help women address the many challenging emotional life situations that arise when struggling to conceive. They use cognitive behavioral and relaxation techniques, and they offer more than 500 different coping options. And they go through, this is the part I particularly like, they go through 50 very specific and quite frankly very common situations that have the potential to cause distress during family building. You can get more information about the Ferticom app at their website, which is ferticomapp.com, and that's spelled FERTICALMAPP.com. Great app, and we thank Ferring Fertility for having been our sponsors as well as for bringing us the Ferticom app. In addition to our underwriter, this show is also supported by our partners. And our impact partners and our outreach partners. And without their support, their generous support, we would not be able to bring you our show and fulfill our mission of providing unbiased education and support. Some of our wonderful partners include IntegraMed. IntegraMed is the largest network of fertility practices in the country by combining the latest innovations in the reproductive sciences with compassionate and customized treatment plans. IntegraMed practices are able to provide the very best possible care. We also have Reproductive Medicine Associates of New Jersey. They are a recognized scientific and patient care leader in the field of infertility. They have 10 offices and 21 physicians throughout New Jersey, and they maintain an IVF delivery rate well above the national average. Today, we're going to be talking about interpreting the results of genetic testing on embryos. Our guests are Dr. Cary Dicken. She is a board-certified reproductive endocrinologist with Sher Fertility Institute in New York. Her special expertise is in poor responders, diminished ovarian reserves, unexplained infertility, irregular periods, and repetitive IVF failure. We also have Amy Jordan, a board-certified genetic counselor with CooperGenomics. She is the former chair of the Genetic Counseling Special Interest Group for the American Society of Reproductive Medicine, and she obtained her master's in human genetics from Sarah Lawrence College. Welcome, Ms. Jordan and Dr. Dicken, to Creating a Family.
Thank you so much for having us.
All right. This is a particular subject that is confusing to people. And one of the reasons I think it's confusing is there are so many different terms, and because it's medicine, and because it's infertility, of course, most of these terms have to have acronyms. And while acronyms help us, they also hurt us. I think it hurts us in this area because oftentimes people don't even know what the acronyms stand for, and if they do know, they don't know what they really mean and the distinction between them. So I'm going to throw out a couple of different acronyms. And Dr. Dicken, we'll start with you. If you could tell us what the acronym itself means, and just kind of a real short version, because we'll be talking more about these different what these different acronyms throughout. All right, let's just start. Well, let's start with PGS. Dr. Dicken, what does that mean?
Yeah. So PGS stands for pre-implantation genetic screening. It basically means looking at the chromosomes in a biopsy from an embryo.
Okay, so distinguish that then, Dr. Dickens, from PGD.
Okay, so PGD is pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. That is when the biopsy itself is being screened for a particular disease that a couple may be at risk for.
Okay, so PGS is kind of general screening. PGD is when you're looking for a specific disease that you believe this embryo or the parents would have higher risk for. Did I get that right?
Yes.
All right. Ms. Jordan, now I'm going to give you one, which is CCS. What does CCS stand for?
So comprehensive chromosome screening. It's often used interchangeably with PGS.
Oh, okay. So CCS and PGS are often used interchangeably then?
That is correct.
Okay, got it. Okay, then Ms. Jordan, tell me about NGS, because I'm seeing that more often now.
Right. So NGS stands for Next Generation Sequencing, and it is a type of technology that can be used to perform PGS testing.
PGS or CCS. It's a specific type of CCS. Okay. And in doing the research for this show, I actually found one that was new to me, which surprised me, I'll be honest. And I will give you the acronym. It's ACGH. Dr. Dicken, I'll give you that, and if you're, I think you'll probably know what it means. You probably not new to you, but if not, I do have the terminology that goes with it.
Yeah, so array CGH is, I guess, and Amy might be able to explain this a little better than me, is an older way or a way that we used to analyze the chromosomes for PGS. So it also is a method for the complete chromosome screening that is separate from NGS.
Right. I would agree with that.
Well, good. It makes me feel, since it's an older way, that's good. I'm glad that I wasn't out of the loop that much. When I saw it, I didn't know what it was. So as I understand, I'm not trying to be oversimplistic, but I wanted to try to simplify it slightly, if possible. So, Ms. Jordan, tell me if this is correct. We have two basic types. So, if our audience is thinking about it, picture two basic types. We have PGD, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, when we're looking for a specific disease that we have reason to believe this embryo is at risk for. And then we have PGS, pre-implantation genetic screening, of which another word for that could be CCS, comprehensive chromosomal screening. And under that, a particular type would be NGS, next generation screening, or an older type, which we're not going to come back to, is the array comparative genomic hybridization. We're not going to come back to that since it's an older one. Did I do is my diagram, my mental diagram I just drew, is that accurate?
You did a great job. Yep, that's exactly what I would say as far as diagrams go.
Okay.
I agree.
All right. Hallelujah. All right. Now, now let's talk about what type of patients, or we'll expand it because it's not just patients, because there are parents who are not infertile who might be considering this as well. So what type, who should consider any form of genetic screening on their embryo? Dr. Dicken, if you'll list off some factors, that would be good.
Okay, so let's start with PGD. So if we're thinking about who is a good candidate for PGD, that would be somebody who has either already had a child that was born with a disease that they would not like to have in another child, or perhaps a couple that has gone through genetic testing themselves, which is usually blood work to screen for recessive disorders, and knows that they are at risk for having a baby with a specific disease.
All right, so that, everybody, let's keep this straight. That is PGD. That's when you're diagnosing for a specific disease. All right?
Right.
Ms. Jordan.
That's correct.
Okay, Ms. Jordan, now tell us who would be recommended to have their embryos treated via PGS, pre-implantation genetic screening.
So PGS is actually an interesting test in that you don't have to have a history of any specific pregnancy outcome in order to be a good candidate for PGS. It's an option that's available to all IVF patients. Now, that being said, they work very closely with their doctor to determine who's the best candidate, but we often see patients who are concerned about the time it might take for them to get to a healthy, successful pregnancy, people who are maybe starting their fertility journey a little bit later than they had planned, or who've had a history of difficult pregnancies or pregnancy losses as good candidates.
Okay, so generally speaking, women over the age of 35, would that be, when you say starting a little later, is our rough cutoff about age 35?
You could say that, yes. I would say most patients are, 35 plus as a general rule.
Dr. Dicken, if you've had a patient who's had multiple failed IVF cycles, would that person also be someone who you would recommend genetic screening on their embryos for? Yeah,
it is something that I would recommend to them, although I do explain, the most common reason we think that IVF and embryo transfers fail is because there likely is a high percentage of embryos that are not genetically normal. And in that case, doing PGS would help us to hone in on which embryo is most likely to lead to a successful transfer, meaning getting them pregnant.
So a genetically abnormal embryo is going to have a hard time or have less chance of implanting into the uterus and growing into a fetus. So hence, and a greater chance of miscarrying, but in this case, the person would never have reached a pregnancy, so has not.
That's right.
All right. So, and Dr. Dicken, I'll ask you this next question as well, and that is, how do you do the either PGD or PGS? How do you test the genetics of an embryo?
So the couple goes through IVF, we are able to create embryos in our laboratory. Those embryos typically, I'd say in the vast majority of cases, develop in the laboratory to day 5 or day 6, which is considered a blastocyst phase, and then we are able to remove maybe 4 cells from the periphery of cells in that embryo, and those cells get sent out to a laboratory to be amplified and analyzed.
All right. Does taking a biopsy of cells from an embryo hurt the embryo in some way? And
I think that I think anytime you do anything invasive to an embryo, there's always going to be the possibility that it could injure the embryo. But the technology that we have now and the way that we take the biopsy, I think the risk is quite low. We are also sampling the cells that are the complete opposite end of the cells that would actually form the baby. We sample cells called the trophectoderm, which ultimately form the placenta. So the risk to the embryo is quite low, but much more of a risk than if you did not do something invasive.
Ms. Jordan, do you see many of 3-day, which is the pre-blastocyst stage, biopsies done on 3-day-old embryos? Do you see that much anymore?
For us now, we're seeing really the majority of embryos, so greater than 95% of embryos samples that are received from day 5 samples. There are some physicians that choose to still do day 3 biopsy, and that's often either personal preference or something specific about the couple that they're working with.
Okay. Now, Ms. Jordan, tell us about, all right, what are you screening for? What are you looking for? You receive a biopsy of an embryo. It comes in. What are you looking for specifically? Because you're not looking for a specific disease at this point, because that would be PGD.
Right, exactly. So for PGS, we're really looking for extra or missing chromosomes. So we know that in cells we expect there to be 23 pairs of chromosomes, or 46 total. And we know that if there are cells that are missing chromosomes, or what's known as monosomy, those embryos typically wouldn't even make a pregnancy, or if they did, they'd be typically a very early pregnancy loss. If the cells from that embryo have an extra chromosome, or what's known as trisomy, then they can sometimes implant, but those generally go on to lead to a miscarriage as well. And sometimes they do make it to delivery. The condition that most people are familiar with, Down syndrome, is caused by an extra chromosome number 21. So we're really looking, the goal of PGS is to look for these extra or missing chromosomes so that those embryos are not your best candidate for transfer.
And are we now able to look at all 23 pairs of chromosomes, Ms. Jordan?
We are, yes. So with the NGS testing, that is something that is done. You can look at all 23 pairs, and that includes the sex chromosomes as well. Okay,
and in the sex chromosomes, which is the 23rd pair, we can determine if there's something, I guess in this case it would probably be a trisomy or something in that. You would have something wrong in those. Okay. All right. So now I guess the $24 million question, and that is, how accurate are the results you get from in this case, we're still talking PGS. So how accurate are the results that you get from PGS? And I'd like to hear both of your thoughts on that, but we'll start with you, Dr. Dicken.
So the way I usually explain this to my patients before they even decide whether they want to do PGS or not, I explain to them that what the data shows us now is that about a third of embryos that actually come back with a normal result after PGS still do not result in successful pregnancies. So I tell them that PGS is a fantastic technology and can really help us to figure out which is their best embryo and is most likely to lead to pregnancy, but PGS, unfortunately, is not perfect.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's certainly what we're hearing from people as well. Ms. Jordan, thoughts on that? How would you advise someone who was asking you a question about the accuracy?
So I would, first of all, I absolutely agree with Dr. Dicken and how she characterized that to her patients. We discussed that as well. When we talk about accuracy, typically we're talking about accuracy in the high 90s, 97, 98%, something like that. But again, to highlight that even for those embryos that maybe don't implant, that doesn't mean that the PGS outcome itself was wrong. We know there's so many other factors going on when it comes to creating a successful pregnancy. And we do, at least for us and where I currently am, we look at any of the outcome data very frequently just to make sure we're giving accurate and up to the minute information to our patients.
All right. So before we leave and we talk about the accuracy and results, we also need to talk about pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. Ms. Jordan, how accurate are, and just to remind everybody, that's when you're looking for a specific disease that this embryo is at risk for. How accurate are the results for when you're doing PGD?
So again, we would consider these tests to be quite accurate, higher than 95%. And the interesting thing about PGD testing is that because we're looking for a condition that's specific to this family and oftentimes mutations in a condition that's specific to a family, the test itself that's created is actually very couple specific. So there's a lot of work that goes into creating that test for this couple. But again, after test creation, we would consider it highly accurate.
Okay. And Dr. Dicken, what can you tell about the implantation and growth potential of an embryo based on genetic testing? This would be going back, well, I suppose it could be accurate for either PGD or PGS, but I think it's more relevant to the PGS question. So people are coming to you wanting to get pregnant, obviously, and you're counseling them on whether or not to do genetic testing, genetic screening. How accurate, not accurate, can you tell them what their odds would be for implantation and growth? Because ultimately that's what they care about.
Right, of course. So when we have embryos that have been biopsied and have gone through PGS and we have normal results, I usually counsel a patient that single embryo is probably giving them somewhere between a 60 to 65% chance of pregnancy, meaning when they come in for their first pregnancy test and it's positive, that tells me implantation has taken place. The potential for that to continue to grow and develop is something that we're going to have to watch and see. There's still the risk of miscarriage even when an embryo has gone through PGS.
Okay, and that was kind of the next question, which is, can you tell anything about the health of the embryo and actually, quite frankly, the subsequent child or an adult based on the results of genetic testing? You just said that you could still have a miscarriage. Can you tell anything about the health risks for this particular child if implantation and a pregnancy occurs? And go ahead and answer that one, Dr. Dicken.
So women who get pregnant from embryos that have had normal PGS results should be treated as anybody else their age who conceived naturally. So they still need all the same genetic screening that their obstetrician will provide for them to determine whether that pregnancy is actually genetically normal. So really the implantation and the positive pregnancy test is just that. Then we, from my point of view, I watch how the pregnancy hormone level rises. I look for normal development on ultrasound, but then ultimately there are non-invasive blood tests and further genetic testing that is done in pregnancy to determine if we think it's going to be a healthy baby.
So even though you've had genetic screening on your embryo, the standard of care is still that you would go through. Would you go through amniocentesis or CVS? Do you need to go through any of which are both more invasive, more than a blood test? Would that be recommended as well, even though you've already had screening on the embryo?
Usually what's first recommended is a non-invasive blood test. And if that result comes back with a very low risk that there is a genetic abnormality with the pregnancy, then most obstetricians, I think, would counsel the patient, maybe based on their age, based on their history, as to whether something more invasive, such as CVS or amnio, is, recommended in their particular case.
Okay. I think that's something a lot of women don't know. I think they're assuming that, let's say they're 36, 37, something like that. I think they're assuming that if they do genetic testing on the embryo, they would not be doing any form of genetic testing on the fetus during the pregnancy. And however, from what I'm hearing you say, they may not be, whereas a 37-year-old might be recommended to have amniocentesis or CVS. They would not necessarily. They would, having had the genetic testing on the embryo, if they might be eligible just for the blood test. I'm trying to summarize what you said. Is that correct, Dr. Dicken?
I think the best summary would be to say that a woman who is, let's say, 37, who is pregnant after a normal embryo has been transferred, should really be treated no differently than a 37-year-old that was conceived naturally. So when she is with her obstetrician for her prenatal care, regardless of how she got pregnant, the same recommendations would be made to her based on her age.
Okay, so she may, which is oftentimes amnio. So that would be given her age. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Ms. Jordan, now I'm going to be asking you. Well, let me break for a moment because this is going to be a big discussion we're getting ready to go into. Now that I've made you nervous, I'll take a break. You are listening to Creating a Family, and today we're talking about interpreting the genetic testing results on embryos. Creating a Family has some of the largest networks, social networks, in infertility. We are currently ranked, I think the last time I checked, number 2 online influencer by clout in the area of fertility. And we're very proud of that. We hang out a lot on the social media because we find that that's where people are getting their information. Therefore, if that's where they're getting their information, our mission is to provide accurate, engaging, medically accurate, and unbiased information, so that's where we have to hang out. We are on Facebook, Twitter, and Pinterest primarily. On Facebook, we have 3 ways to connect. One, with me individually, and that's Dawn.Davenport1, or, of course, we have a Facebook page, which facebook.com/creatingafamily. But we also have a Facebook group. It's a closed group. It is a support group. It's very large and it's very active, and we would love to have you find us and join us. You do have to apply because it's a closed group. You can find that at facebook.com/groups/creatingafamily. Or the easiest way is just to type the words Creating a Family into the Facebook search box. You can like the page and join the group. We also, as I mentioned, hang out on Twitter and Pinterest, and we go by Creating a Family there or at Creating a Family there. All right, Ms. Jordan, I told you that I was leading up to the fact that we're getting ready to talk about a big topic, or let's put it this way, it's one that we get a lot of questions about. In fact, we got 2 questions for today's show on this. I'm not going to read them. Basically, they were wanting to know everything that you could tell us about mosaicism. There is, I honestly don't know if we're seeing it more or just hearing about it more, but we certainly hear about it, and there's a great deal of confusion. So, first of all, let's just tell everybody what mosaicism is. What do we mean by that?
Okay, so mosaicism is, or a mosaic embryo would be one that contains a mix of both normal and abnormal cells. So the confusion comes from, I think, people liking the idea of a black or white answer, and this introduces a shade of gray.
Yeah, that's a great summary and a great understatement. Yes, I think especially when we're talking about the health of our embryo and future children, yeah, black and white is definitely good. All right, so are you seeing more results that are mosaic, or is this just because people are becoming aware of it, and so it's not happening more? We just are talking about it more. Ms. Jordan, are you seeing more?
So the interesting thing about mosaicism is that it's probably always existed, but as our technology gets better, it gets more sensitive. And the array CGH technology you referenced earlier is a technology that's been around since about 2012, and it was not able to detect mosaicism. NGS testing, or the next generation sequencing, which is the newer technology, which has come about in the last year or 2 years, is able to detect mosaicism. So it's not that it wasn't there necessarily before, it's that now we're able to see it. And it's introducing that question of what do you do when you see it, and how do you treat these embryos?
Well, yeah, and that is the big question. What do you do? And it seems to me that if you have quite a few embryos, and most are normal and just one or so are mosaic, that really isn't the question. You would use the ones that are non-mosaic. But what happens if you don't have that option? If you don't have enough or any embryos that are not mosaic? What do you recommend, Ms. Jordan? What are you recommending to people when they see a mosaic result?
So I think the biggest thing when a patient finds himself in this situation is to have a conversation. There needs to be a lot of discussion and dialogue between the patient and their provider, the physician, and the lab as well, to make sure that all the questions do get answered. Really, everybody in this process wants the same outcome for this individual, right? We want the same healthy outcome, same healthy baby. The difficulty is that as you introduce a new technology, you don't always introduce all the answers that come with that new technology. And the information about mosaicism continues to develop and grow, just like any time you introduce new methods in science.
Dr. Dicken, can a embryo that is mosaic grow into a healthy fetus, then baby, then child, adult? What is the potential for a mosaic embryo?
I think that is a great question. Embryos that are mosaic, there are a certain percentage that will form healthy babies. The problem is we do not know which ones are likely to have changes that then result in the normal cell lines continuing on versus those that are going to have a higher percentage of the abnormal cell lines and be an embryo that either would not implant or lead to an early loss. So I agree in that it can be a difficult situation to have mosaic embryos because it's not entirely clear what the outcome of that embryo would be.
And would the ability, let's say that the family transferred, again, this would be the case only, I suspect, if this is her only option, would mosaicism be also able to be picked up during a pregnancy through either the blood test or, let's just at that. Is that something that could be picked up later in pregnancy through the genetic testing, the standard blood tests that are run? Dr. Dicken.
Well, I think, with the blood tests that are being done, and again, I can't speak to it that much because it's not testing that I personally do in my office, but they are screening for some of the more common types of trisomies that were alluded to earlier that could actually result in either a later pregnancy loss or a pregnancy that goes to term that is not normal. Typically, with mosaicism, there are going to be cell lines that continue on in the pregnancy and others that don't. So when women are in first trimester, we're really looking for the cell lines that have been retained within that pregnancy. So the question of mosaicism is not quite as much of a question at that point as it is at the embryo stage.
Oh, all right. And then, so, Ms. Jordan, and this also may not be in your area of expertise either, so feel free to say if it isn't. But if someone has transferred a mosaic embryo, and they want to know, their concern is the potential for a child that will have significant birth defects, will mosaicism be able to be picked up through the CVS or the amniocentesis?
So there's been some discussion about what follow-up testing is best for patients who knowingly transfer a mosaic embryo and any of the, potential risks that may come with that. There's been discussion as far as the amniocentesis being a good option for follow-up testing during pregnancy, because that test actually does sample the fetal cells, or the cells that are sloughed by the skin of the fetus, into that amniotic fluid. So you're getting actual DNA from the pregnancy itself. And that's really one of the best ways that we have right now to look at and address that question.
Dr. Dicken, what type of patients have you seen make the choice to transfer to make the choice to transfer a mosaic embryo? What is the situation that usually arises that would lead somebody to making that decision?
Well, I mean, I can kind of speak about this in generalities. In my personal experience, I do not transfer mosaic embryos or any embryos with an abnormality. But in studies that have been published, there have been documentations of healthy babies born from the transfer of a mosaic or even a potentially abnormal embryo. So I would imagine that the patients who are opting to do this don't have the option to transfer a normal embryo and perhaps transfer something that we think would probably just not result in a pregnancy, like the monosomies we were talking about. But if there is the potential for an embryo to have a normal cell line, then it could correct and be a healthy baby.
And that's the question we seem to be getting, and one of the questioners was asking this exact question. Ms. Jordan, what do they mean by an embryo self-correcting out of mosaicism? That was the direct question that came from Robert.
So self-correction, I think, sometimes is a difficult phrase because it gives this idea that the embryo sort of very intentionally kicked out the abnormal cell line. The idea with mosaicism currently is that it matters where the normal and abnormal cells are in existence within that embryo. So as Dr. Dicken mentioned earlier, where we're taking the biopsy from is the trophectoderm, or the outer layer of cells that go on to become the placenta or the membranes of the pregnancy. So if we find mosaicism there, we know that there are a combination of normal and abnormal cells in the cells that go on to become the placenta. That doesn't necessarily give us information about the cells that actually go on to become the fetus. They're in the inner cell mass, which is away from where they do the biopsy. And for, fairly obvious reasons, I think most people don't, there's not really a recommendation to go ahead and biopsy the inner cell mass because we know those cells become the baby. And so for us, as we are getting more information about mosaicism, it's really where are the normal and abnormal cells and where are they located.
So it's entirely possible that the abnormal genetic cells or the abnormal cells would just be a part of the placenta, which, albeit is very important for the survival of the pregnancy and the fetus, but it's possible that it would not be an abnormality that would be found in the cells, the inner cell mass, which will become the fetus. Am I hearing you correctly, Ms. Jordan?
Yes, that is correct.
And self-correcting would imply, you're right, that there is an intent, but even without the intent, do we have any research which indicates how many, a percentage or the odds that something that embryos where the trophectoderm, the part that would become the placenta, shows mosaicism, and yet the fetus is perfectly normal, and that may or may not be self-correction, but it may mean that the abnormality was not something that was going to interfere with the pregnancy or the health of the fetus. Do we have any idea how often that would be the case, that we would see abnormality that only is on the placenta and will not impact the pregnancy or fetus?
So some of our emerging research is showing that it's about 50% of the time, or half the time, that the inner cell mass and the trophectoderm themselves are concordant with those results. And the way to do that is by testing an entire embryo. So it's people who have very generously donated those embryos for research, and we do see a concordance, but again, it's about half the time. For us, we're getting a little bit more information as far as the way that we call embryos and whether we're considering them sort of high-level mosaic, meaning there's a lot of mosaicism present in the sample that we receive, versus low-level mosaic. And we do see a difference in outcomes from people who are going ahead and transferring those embryos and the chance that they would go ahead and make a pregnancy.
And is there a need for people who have had genetic testing on their embryo and the embryo comes back showing either an abnormality or a mosaic embryo? Is there a need for, if the family is not going to transfer, is there a need for embryos to be donated for research on evaluating mosaicism? Ms. Jordan?
Yes, I would say that's absolutely a need. The only way for us to really learn more about all of this is to do more research and do more studies, and it's really through the generous donation of embryos that is possible.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. All right, we have a question from Donna, and I'm going to read the entire question. She says, we are doing a cycle next January. We are considering genetic testing because we have had 2 failed IVF cycles. 3 embryos the first time, none implanted. 6 embryos the second time with 1 chemical pregnancy. I want to be prepared. What are some of the difficult decisions patients may have to make as a result of genetic testing? It's a fairly general question, but I thought she raised some good questions for this. So I'm going to start with you, Dr. Dicken, and then I'm going to come to, and then if you'll talk about one difficult decision that you've seen people have to make as a result of testing, and then Ms. Jordan, I'm going to come to you second. So, Dr. Dicken, thoughts on, and my gut feel for what Donna is wanting to get prepared for, she didn't say worst case, but I think she's a person who wants to think through what the difficulties might be before she decides on moving forward.
Right. I think that in her case, it does make sense that she should be doing genetic testing. I think some of the difficulties that come with doing genetic testing is, number one, if she is going to be growing these embryos to blastocyst, and I'm not quite sure based on her history if she's done that before, but if she's growing these embryos to blastocyst, there is going to be a certain percentage of embryos that do not survive to the point that we can actually biopsy them. And then of those that do develop properly that are biopsied, it is normal, again, depending on a woman's age, that only a certain percentage are going to be genetically normal. And again, of those, only about a 60 to 65% pregnancy rate per embryo. So there are always these hurdles to get over in achieving a successful pregnancy. I do think, though, that it's helpful to have this information, and even if there are obstacles to overcome, it will ultimately help her and her doctor to go down the right pathway afterwards in achieving a successful pregnancy, whether that means, looking more into, is this a sperm quality issue, is this an egg quality issue, and then how do we try to either remedy that or overcome that?
All right. Ms. Jordan, thoughts on other difficult decisions patients might have to make as a result of genetic testing?
And I would follow in the same vein as Dr. Dicken with that as well. So aside from the mosaics, which we had just discussed, which can be their own difficult decision, there are times, and I talk to all of my patients about the realities, that sometimes there's actually nothing available to transfer, right? If you get to a point where you're testing a few embryos, and those embryos all come back completely abnormal, meaning not mosaic for an abnormality, but abnormal in all of the cells, that would mean that there's not really a next step. There's not a transfer to plan for. And is that something that they're prepared for? How would they approach that as with their physician and with their support network?
But, in that case, it seems to me that even if you had transferred, didn't do the genetic testing and transferred, the odds are extraordinarily low that you would get a pregnancy. And if you were to get a pregnancy, the odds are high that pregnancy would miscarry. So is that a reason to not do it? Because other than the fact that you would have completion, you would know that you would at least have something to transfer. I suppose there is, from a psychological standpoint, an advantage there. But it's not like those embryos would have probably implanted or grown, would it be? And again, this is to you, Ms. Jordan. Yeah.
Right. I would say you're exactly correct there. So it's getting the information that you would likely end up getting at some point anyways. It's just getting it at a time where you may not be expecting it. So a lot of hope, of course, is put through every step of this process. And if there's not a realization that you might get bad news back, that can be very devastating in itself. So I think that's not necessarily a reason not to do it, just something to be prepared for during the cycle.
I would throw out another potentially difficult decision, because I've seen someone who's had to go through this. It was part of our support group. The results came back that the only embryo that they had was trisomy 13, Down syndrome. And quite to her surprise, she had done a number of IVF cycles, and quite to her surprise, she was struggling over whether or not to transfer, because she felt like that she was making the choice between having no children or having a child with Down syndrome. I don't know how common that either it happens or how common that people struggle with the decision. Any thoughts on that, Dr. Dicken?
Well, that would certainly be a very difficult decision. I think that, at least in my practice, like I said, we do not offer transfer right now with an abnormal embryo. So patients, I would not be transferring an embryo that showed either a trisomy 13, 18, 21, any of those that could potentially result in a live birth. I would also try to help the patient to understand that even though we know that children are born, that babies are born with these genetic abnormalities, that the very large percentage of embryos that have a trisomy 21 still do not lead to healthy babies. The majority will either not implant or lead to miscarriage, and so it's still not a great embryo to transfer, in my opinion.
And the other, although I think that the evidence is certainly indicative now that this is not really a disadvantage or even a particularly difficult decision. However, another often reality of doing genetic testing is that you do not transfer that cycle. So the embryos would be frozen, and then in a subsequent cycle, you would do a frozen embryo transfer after your in a month or two. So thoughts on that, Dr. Dicken? I'm not sure that's a disadvantage, but is it fairly standard now to freeze all and then transfer at a subsequent time if you're doing genetic testing?
Yeah, for couples that opt to do genetic testing with their IVF cycle, I'd say the vast majority do end up needing to freeze their embryos and then do a frozen embryo transfer in a subsequent cycle. I do not think that is a disadvantage. In fact, there's data that shows that there's a slightly higher pregnancy rate with frozen embryos compared to fresh. So if it is a good quality embryo, and especially if it comes back with a normal PGS result, I don't think that freezing with the technology we have now is a disadvantage.
Yeah, I find that the research is really strong and really fascinating. That it might make sense for even without genetic testing to allow the woman's body to return to a normal hormonal state and to be better able to track the window of implantation. All right, another question we got that I'm thankful for, because I think this is an interesting question and, quite frankly, one that we probably don't think about, and so I'm very curious to hear your answers. This is from Robin. She wants to know if the results of those tests, meaning genetic testing, embryonic genetic testing, are kept somewhere. Do they follow the resulting child, or are they forever just some embryo? There is so much concern over discrimination on the basis of genetic testing. I just wondered how far back it might go. Ms. Jordan, thoughts on that? The idea of who has access to this, or is this information destroyed? Is there a reason why you would want the genetic testing to be something that's put in the pediatrician's file?
That's a great question, and it is the question that we as genetic counselors do get. Sort of, this is the first test of this embryo, right? And what does that mean for the future? For us, everything is held in-house. It's not shared anywhere. Patients are typically very comfortable with that. We do on occasion get requests to, discard something, whether it's the genetic samples themselves or, the paperwork. But for us, we send all of the results to the ordering physician, and that is all. And Dr. Dicken, I'm sure, can speak to it as well, but my understanding is they go to the medical chart for that patient, and that is where they stay. They're not forwarded on to anyone.
Dr. Dicken?
Yeah, so we have the records in our embryology results in our patient's files here. When a patient is successfully pregnant and is then going to move on to her obstetrician to continue her prenatal care, she may request her records. She may request all of her records or a certain portion of it. In my experience, because obstetricians are going to treat these patients no differently than patients that conceive naturally, I don't think they are really looking for the PGS results. I can't say that I've ever specifically been asked for the embryology results for a patient moving on to her obstetrician. So I would say the majority of my patients will request their records, but I don't think the obstetricians are really all that curious about the PGS results.
Okay. And actually, I've not heard of I suppose a parent would have the option of putting the genetic testing results in their child's or subsequent child's file, medical file, their a pediatrician's file. I've not ever heard of someone doing that, but that doesn't reflect my universe is not that wide. Have you ever heard of Ms. Jordan? I'm just curious to know if you know of anybody who, and would there be an advantage to doing that?
So for those records, what you would need to know for them to be helpful for future use for either that pregnancy or that child is, one, to know which embryo was transferred and created the successful pregnancy, because oftentimes there's more than one embryo tested. And I would say the requests that we get for that information stems more from the genetic counselors that are working with these patients during their pregnancy, discussing the options about CVS and amniocentesis.
Okay, so yeah. Mm-hmm. It's a good question, though. I do think that as we move ever more rapidly into the age of genetic medicine, it's an interesting question, and most of us don't have genetic results at all. But a child who had genetic testing done when they were an embryo, I guess it could be something that at some point down the road would be advantageous, but on the other hand, it wouldn't be that hard to get to do genetic testing in the future. And at that point, it would be it would be easy to get genes from cells from the child. So why would you ever really need to go back to testing that was done at the embryonic stage? I'm not sure I'm making sense on this. It just seems I'm trying to even imagine a scenario where it would ever be helpful. Dr. Dicken, any thoughts before we move on?
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree with what you just said. Once you have an established pregnancy and you're able to actually test DNA from the fetus, or once the baby is born and you can test the DNA from the baby, there really is not a need for the results of the genetic testing on the embryo. We, of course, will always keep track of which, embryo had a specific result and which embryo was tested. We have all of those records, but it really it may not be quite as clear, because sometimes we transfer only one embryo, sometimes we transfer more than one embryo, sometimes we transfer an embryo that has been tested along with another embryo that has not been tested. And of course, if there are clear differences in gender, you can easily distinguish between two embryos that led to a transfer of two embryos that led to one pregnancy, but sometimes you can't. So yeah. So every clinical situation is going to be different, but I agree with sort of your last statement in that once you have a healthy baby, or once you have a baby, you can then test the baby's genetics.
Right, and it would be more accurate because you're testing the actual genes of the child versus the genes that were part of the outer cell mass, which was not the actual genes of the child. Anyway, it's a fascinating question. I'm glad we got it. Another question, this one she asked that I not use her name. She said, we have been trying for 4 years to get pregnant. We are both teachers, and our insurance doesn't cover fertility treatment. We are saving, but we feel like we are racing the clock. We will have enough saved for one IVF before summer break next year. I am 37 years old. No doctor has found anything wrong with me, and my husband's sperm is great. How much does genetic testing add to the cost? What are my options if I don't test? What are my options for saving money if I do test? If I were to get pregnant, can I test then? All right, so let's start with her first question is, how much, Dr. Dicken, does genetic testing add to the cost of an IVF cycle?
That is a great question. I would say, and again, I don't work with the finances all that much, but I would say for somebody paying out of pocket, it is probably going to tag on a couple of $1,000s to do PGS.
Okay. Her second question, well, I'll go ahead and give this one to you because it's more of a medical question. What are my options if I don't test? I'm not exactly sure what she's asking. So what are her options for IVF if they make the decision that they do not want to try to afford testing?
So to go through an IVF cycle without doing genetic testing of the embryos, we would create embryos. Those that develop properly would be graded subjectively. Those subjective grades do correspond to likelihood of pregnancy, and we would presume a certain percentage are normal and try to optimize the number of embryos we transfer in a safe method in hopes that a single transfer leads to pregnancy. Once a woman is successfully pregnant, the same test options exist that we were discussing before, the non-invasive blood test, CVS, amniocentesis. She would always have those options once she is pregnant to determine whether there is any abnormality with the chromosomes of the pregnancy.
Okay. And her last question, and I don't know if either of you know the answer to this, but I'll send it to you, Ms. Jordan, to begin with. What are her options for saving money on genetic testing? Is that something... do either of you, well, let me start with you, Ms. Jordan, do you know if there are ways that people can save money? Are some of these tests less expensive than others?
So, it's certainly a good thing to discuss with her physician as far as what her options are for testing or not testing. Depending on where they're planning on doing genetic testing, there may be different sort of packages or plans to help, because she certainly, she unfortunately is not the only one to be experiencing financial hardship when trying to create her family. And so there are other things as well, like fertility financing and lending programs. So definitely good things to discuss with her provider.
Right, and I'm glad you mentioned that. And I suspect I don't know if she selected a clinic or not, but it's a good point that there are financing options. There are also different packages that she may or may not be eligible for, some of which include genetic testing as part of the package. So that's something to absolutely talk with your provider about. Let me stop for a moment and thank one more of our partners and who has allowed us to bring you this show. They have been longtime supporters of creating a family, and that is Fairfax Cryobank. They have been a leader in sperm donation for over 25 years and are dedicated to supplying updated, verified, and accurate medical and personal information on their donors. Only 1 in 200 applicants make it through their screening process to become a donor. Well, thank you both very much, Dr. Cary Dicken and Dr. Amy Jordan, for being our guests today on this show to talk about a topic that we're hearing, of course, more about, and from our audience, and as it becomes more and more common throughout reproductive treatment, I think that we'll be continuing to hear more questions. And the exciting thing is that everything's developing so rapidly in this area, it's very exciting for the future and what it brings. For those people wanting to get more information about CooperGenomics or Amy Jordan, they can go to that website, which is CooperGenomics.com. For those people who are wanting more information about Dr. Dicken or about the Sher Institute, they can go to that website, which is, I love this URL, haveababy.com. For everyone else, I will see you next week. And, hey, do us a quick favor. Will you please give us a quick ranking on iTunes? Go to iTunes Podcast and give us a quick ranking, and I would really appreciate that. Thank you so much, and I will see you next week.
Your hands were made for greatness. Mighty hands for painting, paneling, and clicking the submit order button on HomeDepot.com to get that duvet. And these Egyptian cotton towels delivered right to your door. Do more with decor at the Home Depot. Save up to 30% on select bedding and bath. Now at HomeDepot.com. More saving, more kinds of doing. Valid on select items online only. Free delivery on select items $45 or more. Enter promo code BEDBATH15 at purchase for an extra 15% off. Visit HomeDepot.com for more information.
Paycor knows HR teams are under pressure to recruit and retain top talent. You need more than HR tech. You need expertise at the core. Meet Paycor. Our technology saves you time. Our expertise helps you make a difference. Paycor.com/meetpaycor.